So my name is Scott Becker. I'm Editorial Director of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm pleased to be moderating our first session, as well as welcoming you today to our Hybrid Cloud 101 Summit, brought to you by Nutanix. Editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review has worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Also, during today's third session, we'll be giving away a Microsoft Surface, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor, Nutanix, available in the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Nutanix underwriting this content that we can bring you the summit, so we thank them for sponsoring the summit, supporting this community, and we ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this one in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Hybrid Cloud 101, why hybrid and top enterprise use cases. So this session features Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he's led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. Dave, welcome to the session. Thanks for joining us, and please take it away.
Scott and team, thank you very much for having me here today. It's my distinguished pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to our attendees. And this is a really kind of cool topic for me to have a chance to speak to. And the reason that it's cool for me is that I've been around in the IT industry since really the inception of cloud computing. And so, we rewind 10, 12 years ago, major cloud players are starting to, really pick up steam in the industry. I've seen the evolution of large organizations, small to mid-sized organizations, and very small organizations make the move to the cloud in some form. And so in today's session, this 101 hybrid cloud session, I wanted to discuss some of the pros and cons and some kind of real-world notes that I've seen for organizations that are, making that journey to the cloud or are potentially already there. So I really hope as attendees you're able to pick up a few gold nuggets through the session. And as always through these sessions, I want to make sure that you have the ability to post some questions. We're going to leave some time for some live Q&A towards the end of the session. And please, if you have anything that you want to discuss or a burning topic, feel free to type it in there, and we'll do our absolute best to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing that I do when I have discussions with customers is we have a discussion around the cloud or nothing and kind of what exactly that means. Because in your journey to cloud computing, does it mean that your organization has to go in and buy in 100% into all cloud-based services? Or is there kind of a happy medium that we can find where we're going to potentially leave some of those resources on-prem? What I'm finding right now with most organizations is that there's at least some projects that's in play right now for cloud computing. You might not even understand with your organization that you're using a form of cloud computing today. Do you have Office 365 subscription? Do you use Microsoft Teams? Do you use those SaaS applications for your favorite with your favorite CRM vendor? Those are all portions of cloud computing. It depends on what it is that we want to actually do with that. That's going to make a good use case for us. Now, as we go through this kind of journey to the cloud, one of the big things that always resonates with me is, do you have the ability to move your resources back and forth between the cloud or between cloud vendors potentially? This is really important because the decisions that are made today that seem like a good idea and the architecture really makes sense for us might not make sense depending on what the future of our organization looks like. Maybe your organization goes through a heavy merger and acquisition cycle. Maybe the direction of the business has changed because, of a world-changing pandemic like COVID-19. Maybe your organization has had to reinvent itself. And maybe that means that you have to bring some of those workloads back from the cloud and run them on-prem on some type of hybrid infrastructure. And this is one of the things that I think that we really need to think about moving forward with a hybrid configuration, because right now the big push that I see with organizations is to see how many of these on-prem workloads they can potentially move into the cloud. And I think the burning question in the back of our minds as IT pros and cloud admins is, in the event that something happens or business direction changes, can we actually move those back on-prem if required? And what does that look like for our organization? The next thing is to really analyze all of the infrastructure that we're running and to see if it's going to be a good fit for potentially running in the cloud. And that's going to lead into kind of my next topic, is that not all infrastructure is potentially a good fit for pure cloud computing. So what does that mean? And what type of infrastructure would have issues with this? Well, potentially if you've got an isolated or an offline network, it's going to be difficult to have some type of cloud computing. Maybe you've got requirements to keep all of that on-prem in a hardened environment. That's going to be challenging for you. I personally, in my job, deal with a lot of plant networks where we've got integrated circuits and programmable logic controllers that control all of the plant operation systems. Typically, those configurations are going to be handled by on-prem infrastructure. And so, we have to look at that as something where, maybe we can't move that up to the cloud. Maybe it's just not going to work. It's not going to be viable for us. And maybe simply you've got restrictions for those particular networks that infrastructure is riding on, where those users are accessing that data, that have restrictions to the internet. Maybe you're not going to have availability to connect into your favorite cloud provider. Maybe there's no ability to stand up a site-to-site VPN or, an express route configuration where we can connect into there. And so in those types of scenarios, having a hybrid solution inside of your back pocket is really key, because in my opinion, although the cloud is good for a lot of things, it's not necessarily good for everything that we run inside of our infrastructure and on our networks. And the other thing that we have to consider is that, and a lot of organizations, have to think about this, we have wide-scale outages of cloud-based services. And I'm not going to name names inside of this particular webinar. If you're an IT pro, you probably experienced the same outages that all of us did going throughout the year, and they're from the big two and the big three vendors that are out there, and they all have experienced outages. And so, having the ability to, at least be able to fail back over on-prem is really key for us when we're taking and we're working through these designs, because having that infrastructure available to us is really key. And I'll give you a scenario here where, organization X is looking to offload some of their CapEx costs, and, they don't want to have to buy that on-prem infrastructure anymore. And they decide to take a stab at running some of those plant networks in the cloud. Said cloud vendor has some type of an outage. So, that means that critical process controllers and the workloads that are driving all of that infrastructure are now no longer available. Well, in in those cases, that's not a viable option. You always need to have that kind of on-prem first mentality with that type of a configuration. Now, I know a lot of the vendors will say, well, there's solutions, and you can build in redundancy, and you can do a lot of these pieces. But I'm really, truly old school at heart. And the fact of the matter is that when I look at a design of, modern computer systems that are built to control plant networks and things like that, and when we have a good, solid design that's in place that hasn't let us down over the last 10 years, maybe we've had to harden it a bit because of recent cybersecurity attacks and things like that. What that really means for me is that, if it's not broke, well, we don't necessarily need to change it. In that mindset, we still have to keep an open mind to new technologies and things like that are out there, but especially for those core and critical networks, those are key. The other thing is that it's not necessarily easy to move all of our existing infrastructure and outside of the plant networks up to the cloud. And specifically, I want to talk about here your existing custom homegrown line of business applications. I'm dealing with one of my larger customers right now where, they're a core laboratory systems applications, their LIMS, their laboratory information management systems. These were built on Power Builder going back 25 to 30 years ago. And so these are systems that control all of the lab analyzers and scanners and things like that. And then they're going to tie back into, Central SQL or Oracle databases. And like that level of instrumentation and how it feeds data back into the core line of business applications, especially when that organization has completely written their own homegrown application to manage all of these different analyzers across North America, that's a bit of a challenge because, you're talking about a code-based transition, heavy development efforts, and one of the reasons that they've been so successful as an organization is they've been able to stay agile as a development team, staying ahead of all of the kind of latest trends and making sure that their clients are getting access to everything that they need and making sure that company can stay ahead. So transitioning those line of business applications to me is the biggest challenge in moving any of this stuff up and over to the cloud. So for that, our on-prem hybrid infrastructure is maybe a good fit. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that we can't move pieces of that application up to the cloud because there's certain features that are very advantageous. For example, global load balancing features, being able to take and offload the front-end application services into maybe some Kubernetes clusters that run up in the cloud. Maybe that makes a lot of sense, but the back-end on-prem infrastructure is still a very, very big requirement for those types of organizations. The next two that I want to mention here are infrastructure that we don't necessarily think about with many organizations. And that is, for example, our existing on-prem email solutions that we have. And so I still run across a lot of organizations that are still running on early versions of Microsoft Exchange, even although they're running beyond support from Microsoft, we're still seeing migrations from Exchange 2010 that are out there. And those organizations, for a variety of reasons, they don't want to necessarily put all their email up into the cloud, so they're going to continue running on-prem mail environments. A lot of organizations are still running older versions of servers because they have dependencies for those line of business applications. A lot of organizations are, especially with COVID-19, have massive virtualized desktop farms, VDI farms that are built, Citrix farms that are built, remote desktop session hosts that are built to allow users in. And, a lot of that infrastructure drives really well in a hybrid configuration. Yes, I can push some of it up to the cloud, but maybe it just makes more sense for us to run that from a hybrid configuration. Some of the services that I see, though, as kind of no-brainers to get yourself started in this journey, I mentioned it earlier, would be something like Office 365, looking at all of those services that are provided up there. And so when I look at Office 365 from an email platform versus traditional on-prem Exchange, for me, if I had to talk to a customer about this today and they're still running that on-prem infrastructure, it's not going to get migrated overnight. It's going to be a project, of course. I would say the number one thing that you want to think about is security, and especially cybersecurity, and making sure that those applications are hardened. Those cloud-based applications like Office 365 versus on-prem Exchange, your on-prem Exchange, if you haven't gone through all of the measures to lock it down and making sure that it's secure, are going to be a challenge. And in fact, look at all of the Exchange vulnerabilities that came out in the past year, where the FBI actually had to go in and patch customer servers because they weren't doing it themselves. And so that says a lot about, how secure a lot of those organizations actually are because of that. And so when you look at the cloud-based services that, like, for example, Microsoft provides with Office 365, you're going to take and you're going to have something that has a deeper integration from advanced threat protection and security as well. Now, what are some of the things that you want to consider with your hybrid solution that it is that you're going to be moving forward with? And this could play true for an active project that you've already got in flight right now today as well, is how easily can I move to the cloud and back if required? So we talked about this a little bit earlier, because in certain cases, if that application is not performing well, or that key line of business application, and I'll go back to my previous example of the laboratory equipment, it's just not functioning properly, well, I can't really shut down that entire lab. That could be a 150,000 square foot building that's, full of lab analyzers and staff that are trying to get work done. I can't leave that shut down while I'm trying to figure things out. I might have to bring that back from the cloud while we're trying to, go through a rollback period. So what you have to think about as you move these things up is how hard is it to bring them back? Is coexistence something that you're going to look at for an infinite period of time? Maybe it makes sense to leave some of that infrastructure on-prem forever. For example, take those lab analyzers and the servers that they feed to locally on-prem. Does it really make a lot of sense to take and to push those into the cloud, or are you going to have some type of a hybrid solution for those particular locations? Because if the network goes dark, if we lose access to the internet, can my labs keep running? That's my question. And so the short answer is, with a hybrid solution, the answer is yes, absolutely. So at least I can keep people working. And then maybe my data movers can just queue up all of that traffic and then feed it up to the cloud at a later point in time. Now, when we're looking at hybrid solutions, licensing always comes to mind, and I'll premise the entire discussion around licensing that I am not a licensing expert. I give guidance based on my own experience, and that's it. So when we look at the licensing, check to see what the licensing costs are going to be. Are you going to be dinged twice to run part of your infrastructure on-prem and in the cloud? And the example that I have that comes to mind is, let's say that you have to split your infrastructure and you have to run some production database SQL servers on-prem and you have to run now some in the cloud. Does that mean that I'm now having to double up on SQL licensing costs? Because that could be a substantial amount of money for your organization if you have to do that, if you do have to run on both sides. So you want to make sure you check that, because that's a bit of the fine print that comes back to bite the IT teams and the architecture teams later on when they have to take and have a true-up and that particular agreement with the said licensing vendors. The next thing that I really like is a single pane of glass for management. When I run workloads in my favorite cloud provider and I have on-prem infrastructure, I want to have a single pane of glass where I can see my workloads on both sides. where I can take and I can build a virtual machine or workload with the same template on either side. I let the system do all of the orchestration for me. And as an IT pro and cloud administrator, I don't necessarily really care as to how that gets built out. I just need to make sure that it's available, it's reliable, and it's secured. And I want that single pane of glass to be available. The other thing I want the single pane of glass to do for me from a management perspective is I want it to have the ability to have a good level of delegation built into it, so my lower level IT teams can do some of the basic tasks required, like, for example, start and stop a virtual machine, gain access to a virtual machine, and just do the things that are required for their daily, day-to-day jobs. And those are really important things that we have to look at and consider as we take and go through and looking at that particular solution. The next piece is so important, all right? So if you're going to walk away with something from my presentation today, I want you to think about this, is that when we build cloud or hybrid solutions, especially with the state of affairs that we're in with cybersecurity, your DR and your backups need to be treated as important production infrastructure in the same way that your production infrastructure is treated. Because when you have that bad Monday morning event, when you come in and there's a threat actor inside of your network and you have a ransom note sitting on a printer, trust me, you are going to want to have viable access to those backups and make sure that they actually work. So make sure you're testing your backups, make sure you're securing your backups, make sure that you're taking and spending enough money on your backup infrastructure. Do not go out there and get the absolute cheapest storage appliance that you can possibly find and dump all of your backups on there. You get what you pay for when it comes to this stuff. So when it comes time to failing over your hybrid environment, you need to make a bit of an investment here where, the critical tier 1 workloads that it is that we're running, we need to make sure that I've got enough on-prem hybrid horsepower or cloud horsepower inside of our tenant and subscription to run DR. It doesn't necessarily need to run as fast as production, but it needs to at least work. And I'm going to give everyone here a little story. If you sat my presentations before, you know I like to have little stories when I give these presentations, and here's another one for you. This story goes like this. Customer decides that they're going to buy a NAS appliance, network storage appliance, to store all of their backups and replicas of all of their infrastructure, and that's going to be part of their key DR strategy. Man, it looked so shiny when they took and they pulled the trigger on that PO and they bought that piece of infrastructure, because it gave them something like 80 terabytes of usable space, so much room to put everything. Well, what the IT team neglected to look at with that particular DR and backup solution was the fact that when primary production went down, and that's where all of our backups and replicas were living, that NAS appliance actually had enough horsepower to run about 4 of the probably, I think in that organization, about 60 VMs effectively. If you tried to run upwards of 10 VMs on there, it would come to a grinding halt. Latency on ping times was through the roof. You couldn't access the applications. They had already started to return to service some of the key line of business accounting applications, and then the accounting teams are coming back saying this application is totally unusable. Not a very pleasant experience. And then the problem was, we're just going to move all of the data off of this 80 terabyte NAS appliance and we'll move it over to some bigger gear now. We'll fix the problem now after the fact. Well, The problem is that NAS appliance only had gig adapters connected to it, so the line speed that we could pull data off of there wasn't nearly as fast as what the business was expecting. So now what should have been a fast and effective DR solution and failover solution was now we're talking 24, 48, 72 hours later for a return to any effective operations for that organization, and that wasn't a very fun process. So once again, a key point here is that whenever you're looking at your infrastructure today, you want to make sure that you spend the money on DR, on your backup targets, on your replica targets, and make sure that that has enough horsepower to actually run DR. Because the tools will look fine. They'll move your data over there. It's when you actually go to turn it on that you're going to have a problem. So my new advice that I have to organizations is that when you're looking at a hybrid solution and a hybrid infrastructure, one of the things that you want to consider is at the time of purchase, potentially look at purchasing a second appliance from that particular vendor, and you want to have that for DR. Like I said, it doesn't need to necessarily be as fast, but it needs to be fast enough so that it will at least be able to bring on those critical tier 1 workloads that are required to keep the business operational. So spend the money on DR. DR is just as important as production, especially when we look at a hybrid type of configuration. And then the last piece that I want to bring up here is that attackers actively go after your backup and replica DR infrastructure, especially in the case with ransomware attacks. So one of the things that you want to consider is that you have an air-gapped immutable backup solution or target where that is stored. And by immutable, I mean that's got a separate set of credentials that the bad guys can't get in there to manipulate anything. And the other thing is you also want to consider having some type of a guarded fabric built where you're storing all of this infrastructure, because you're unfortunate like me, I have to go through 7 ransomware recoveries in the last 16 months. You don't want to have an admin level attack that wipes out not only all of your production infrastructure, but also all of your backup and DR infrastructure as well. So consider moving all of your critical hypervisor workloads for your hybrid infrastructure out to a separate domain and forest and separate set of credentials that are outside of that individual single domain. All right, the next one here, hybrid security. Wow, the landscape has changed a lot over the last 24 months when it comes to security. And the short answer, if you're working with your business and they say, well, the security stuff is costing a lot of money. We don't want to take and spend the money on all of this right now. We've got to do more important things with the business right now. And so, it's not our problem, or it's not a problem until it is a problem. Well, interestingly enough, with all of the ransomware attacks, and bring up kind of 3 topics around this. Number one is, if you're an executive that's listening to this, Gartner has actually just come out with a new study stating that CEOs and top executives, and if you're from Canada, where I'm from, directors of organizations, are going to potentially be held personally liable in the event of ransom and cybersecurity attacks. This is kind of a big deal for executives, because burying our heads in the sand saying we're not going to be next, this is just an issue that's impacting our neighbors, is not a viable answer anymore. You need to take this seriously, because so many organizations have been hit recently, and this is something that is something that you immediately need to start addressing. If your cyber teams aren't actively looking at hardening your environments, you need to start looking at building a cyber team and having the proper and appropriate defenses in place. The next point that I want to bring up here that's not on the slides is the fact that cyber security insurance is changing. I know it's at least changing for a lot of us up here in Canada. And the thing that I want you to do leaving the session is check your policies. This is serious, because a lot of key executives lead with the fact that, well, you know what, our security is good enough, and in the event that we get ransomed, we have insurance. Insurance will step in, and insurance will protect us. And so one of the things you have to think about with this is that, have you read the fine print under policy? Have you gone through and looked at what this actually means? Because when we take a look at our existing policies, at least up here in Canada, I got off an executive roundtable last week, and the executive roundtable last week meant something like this. We reviewed our cyber insurance policies, and the cyber insurance vendor came back to us, and they have now told us that our new premiums for these policies are going to be half of the value of the policy. And so what that means for you as an organization is, if you had a $3 million policy, you now need to have a $3 million reserve fund in order to take and pay out. So if you want your $3 million, yeah, we're going to give you half, and you're going to have to pay half, and you're going to have to pay that half up front. I don't know very many organizations that have $1.5 million slush fund, reserve fund, just sitting there for in the event that they get a ransomware attack. So it's pushing organizations immediately to start thinking about hybrids and/or cloud security. The next question that I often get asked is, it's in the cloud. Is this something that I actually need to secure? Is it important to secure cloud-based computing systems in the same way that I'd have to secure on-prem? And so the short answer of this one is yes, absolutely, 100% you need to secure that infrastructure. And if you're not sure how to secure that infrastructure, Microsoft actually helps you out with this. And I'm a Microsoft professional, so I'll lean on my Microsoft experience. Other cloud vendors will have their own ways of doing this. But let's say that you need an organization that you're going through a PCI, ISO, or like HIPAA compliance or something like that, just, the typical things that we need to do to lock down and secure our information systems that are out there. They've got a feature called Azure Blueprints that will actually kind of walk you through this, and it's an infrastructure and kind of a template for your tenant that you can have that will help you build that and go through that process of locking that down. They also have what's called the Cloud Adoption Framework, and the Cloud Adoption Framework will walk you through all of those pieces and give your teams critical and viable training that they need to make sure that that's locked down. The short of it is if you fire up a server in the cloud and you think that it's secure just because it's there, you still need to dial the knobs the same way that you need to dial them for your on-prem infrastructure, okay? So important to look at doing this. And then the last piece of this is with our antivirus that we run on our servers. And so antivirus is not enough anymore. It's not. You need to have some type of advanced persistent threat protection that is loaded on your key and critical workloads that you're running, especially for not only hybrid but also your cloud-based systems. The cloud-based systems, the vendors do a little bit better job from an integration perspective, but this is still something that, you want those threat protection agents loaded on all of that key and critical infrastructure, because one of the things that traditional antivirus won't help you with is showing patterns of, for example, lateral movement through an infrastructure, showing patterns of, infection or files or trends, or being able to use AI inside of the solution to kind of determine what the next hops are for those threat actors that are potentially gaining access inside of your infrastructure. And so when we take a look at this, ATP is not an option anymore. Any clients that I work with, we are going to take and mandate that as something that they have to take and have in order to be protected. And if nothing else, the advanced threat protection solutions that are out there from your vendors of the choice do nothing but help your IT and your cybersecurity teams gain visibility into where the holes potentially are existing inside of your infrastructure. The reality is that our cyber teams that we have for our organization are probably spread pretty thin from a resource perspective. So arming them with the right tools is really important. And if you don't think that this is important yet after listening to this, the U.S. government has just announced that they're going to be treating ransomware attacks at the same level of terrorism. So when you have ransomware attacks, and this is hitting your organization, it's actually treated at the same level as like cyber terrorism right now. It's that serious of an impact. You think about the impact that the Colonial Pipeline had in all of those states that are out there that all of a sudden didn't have gas at the gas pump anymore because a threat actor got in there and shut things down. I saw a report that came out today on the Colonial Pipeline in particular that it looks like they got in through a single password. So single password is how they were able to get in. So we haven't seen a lot of released details on that, so that's kind of new and fresh off the press. All right, so let's change gears here a little bit. Let's focus the balance of the presentation here on hybrid deployments and what this looks like for your organization and what some of the important pieces are that you should look at when evaluating a vendor that you're going to be looking at working with. Because when we look at hybrid deployments, we always still have to consider the fact that we have infrastructure requirements that are going to be part of that solution. So you're still going to have servers, you're still going to have, and servers, I mean physical servers that are going to be running your hypervisors. You're still going to be having network switches, and you're still going to be having storage. Now, most organizations today are moving away from the traditional three-tier storage model where you would have network storage and your compute kind of as a three-tier build. And most organizations are taking advantage of software-defined hyper-converged infrastructure. And for a variety of reasons, this can introduce some immense cost savings into an organization by heading down the road of hyper-converged infrastructure. And this is just a bit of a shout out to our sponsor of the session here today. Nutanix does, an excellent job with, their platforms and their solutions that are out there. And they're going to be giving some sessions a little bit later on today regarding this. So when you take a look at those solutions, regardless of who the vendor is, though, I kind of have a 6-point hit list that I always look at for an evaluation criteria for on-prem hybrid deployments. Number one is node orchestration. And kind of what does that mean? Well, it's the go-live time between you unboxing a server and from it becoming a viable member of a cluster and being able to participate in storage, network, compute, and all of those pieces that are involved. And so how much can your software-defined engine orchestrate that process of node additions, firmware updates, driver updates, network updates, switch updates, and things like that? And along those lines of orchestration, what does it look like when I have to go to add a node? Am I adding a node simply because of the fact that I need to take and add more compute, or am I adding more storage? What happens in the event that, we need to remove a node? Maybe it was a failed node. My case, we had a failed CPU in one of our nodes last week that we had to deal with. How does that work from an orchestration perspective? Can you survive a node failure? These are all questions that you need to be asking. And along those lines, what does that look like for adding or removing drives? And how well does your solution determine the kind of failing drive? The real crux or the kryptonite of any storage solution has always been the kind of failing drive, the one that doesn't actually show failed yet. How well does your solution deal with finding those drives and helping you kind of through that process, right? So kind of my 6 quick hitters of, looking at hybrid infrastructure. And then the last one is upgrading your HCI hosts. And then as soon as we're done this slide, Scott, we'll go ahead and we'll take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there's some burning ones that are out there. Whenever I look at upgrading HCI hosts, one of the things that I look at is how hard is it to actually upgrade to the latest core OS version on those particular models? Are in-place upgrades supported, or is this going to be a wipe and reload exercise? Am I going to be having to fail over those workloads over to remaining nodes in the cluster for our on-prem hybrid infrastructure? Or am I going to have to shut the business down during this upgrade process? So I call it the process of hot patching and hot upgrading. Now, hot in the sense that I'm going to move everything off of a particular node, do the work that I need to do from a maintenance perspective, and balance out the rest of the workloads across the rest of the infrastructure. Now, when we look at these upgrades, is it the time where we should just look at upgrading that infrastructure, or should we life cycle that infrastructure? Because maybe the policy in our organization is, we've got a 36-month window for hardware, and after that, we're going to be, refreshing. Or do you have a 60-month cycle, or do you have a run it till it dies mentality in your organization? I've seen it all. And so you're going to make a decision. Should I just upgrade this, or should I life cycle and buy new? And I like the idea of a 36-month life cycle process because for a lot of designs that I have, I'm always struggling to get more gear for my DR side of the project. So for those DR side of the projects, being able to life cycle the production gear and move it over to DR for me makes all kinds of sense, especially if we can do this in a hot type of fashion. And that leads to my kind of final point that we'll talk about here is, can your older HCI on-prem hybrid hardware be repurposed inside of your infrastructure, and what have I seen organizations do with this? And so the short answer is the HCI vendors have typically picked very good hardware platforms. I have a lot of my HCI hyperconverged infrastructure that's out there still running, going on 6 years now. Now, it's not running necessarily production. It might be running DR, and then after it's repurposed out of DR, my teams are always struggling for, on-prem gear, physical hosts to learn with. So I find it's a 3-tier cycle for the infrastructure. You go from production to potentially life cycling over to DR and kind of a tier 2, but it's still good gear. And then the tier 3 is it can move into a lab inside of your infrastructure, which is very important for your IT teams to be able to learn off of. Now, the cool part about this is hyperconverged infrastructure has been around for long enough now that a lot of organizations are entering their first phase of hardware refreshes of the same type of gear right now. So what I'm telling you is, don't necessarily have to throw away that gear. You could always move into the lab, or your DR teams are probably more than willing to accept that for their DR projects, because it's probably a lot better hardware than what they have to work with today. And with that, Scott, I think we've still got a bit of time left here. Why don't we see if we can field a few questions from the audience?
Okay, Dave, sounds good. Yep, and so if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in to the console there. But let's start off with a few here. Dave, one of the things that you talked about was portability, going back and forth. Have you seen organizations come back from the cloud to on-prem? And if so, what was the reason that they did that?
So that's a fantastic question, Scott. And the short answer is yes, I have seen organizations do this, and I'll give one really great example as to where this can potentially happen inside of your organization, and it starts with kind of a senior leadership approach. Old leadership at the company said, "Yeah, I attended the conference and I drank the Kool-Aid, and we're going all in cloud. We're gonna move up there, and if you don't like that and you don't buy into that, well, the ship is sailing, and you can either get on board or you can leave." So the IT team's like, "Okay, we're gonna move to the cloud," and then they moved to the cloud, and for the most part, everything was working well. But then all of a sudden, a change in leadership came for that organization. And the new leadership that came in said, yeah, we're a little bit concerned about, the availability of this infrastructure. And we want to, take all of that work that you've done, my dear IT team, and we want to now bring it back on-prem. So one of the examples of that is a leadership change, Scott, where, we want to take and have just a different direction for the IS organization and to the cloud and back, right? And one other example of that was an organization that had sustained one of those cloud outages and directly impacted their business in a very big way after they had moved a bunch of resources up to the cloud. They had decided that maybe it's not just quite ready for them yet, and they wanted to move it back. And so that's where that point of portability comes in and becomes so important to organizations. It's that for whatever a variety of reasons, you should always have a plan that the what if I need to bring this back, is it possible? Add that to your project.
Right. Okay, great. What are some of the biggest drawbacks that you've seen of hyperconverged and hybrid solutions?
So some of the biggest drawbacks, well, that's a great question. Normally we always talk about the speeds and feeds and how well everything works and how much faster it is and how it's going to change the lives of the organizations and the IT professionals. So I'm guessing where this question's coming from is there any hidden things that aren't part of the normal discussion? And for me, one of the bigger areas is that from a benefit perspective, you're definitely saving a lot of money going to a hyper-converged infrastructure. You're getting a lot more bang for your buck. It's a fast, high-performance system. No doubt, it performs, okay? One of the things that I found is a drawback is the weight and the load that it puts on the IT operations team, because it does take a little bit more work for the traditional IT team to manage a hyper-converged infrastructure solution, especially if you're not using full automation for patching our hyper-converged hosts and our workloads that are driving that hyper-converged infrastructure. So when it comes time to patch, if you're not in a fully automated setup and you have to do some of that manual, this is what it looks like, Scott. Is that we can have a cluster. Say let's say for argument's sake we have a 3-node cluster that's driving our hyper-converged infrastructure. Well, the architecture design build states that maybe you can reboot one of those hosts at a time. So the process looks like you failing everything over to the remaining hosts, you patching it, you rebooting it, but when it comes back online, you can't just move on right away onto the second host, because the storage tier of that needs to rebalance itself. So I need to gain back the full level of resiliency between each of those nodes that I've got. So that takes some time. And so when we're doing that manually, an operation where the teams where they had a disaggregated solution where storage was totally separate and they could just rip through their hypervisors, that could potentially happen a lot faster for them. So they have to budget a bit more time from a patching, maintenance, and operation perspective.
Okay, great. Hey, next question. This one comes from Carlos, and it's actually a really good question for you because of both your hybrid experience and also your Microsoft MVP sort of familiarity with Microsoft. So Carlos's question is: does it seem like Microsoft is willing to support legacy products if you move to the cloud versus no longer supporting legacy products if they're not in the cloud? And I think we saw maybe with Exchange recently, with the Exchange issue that you mentioned. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great question, Carlos. Thank you very much. And I think specifically, the thing is that Microsoft came out and they said, well, you can run your infrastructure on-prem if you want in your hybrid configurations, but you're going to hit end of life. If you move that to the cloud, we're going to provide you with a little bit better extended support for your Windows servers and your SQL servers. So from Microsoft's perspective, are they going to support that in a deeper way than you continuing to just leave that on-prem? And I think the answer is, from what I've seen, at least in recent years, yes, absolutely. The better solution, though, is, honestly, the better solution, if your on-prem infrastructure is working well for you, that's a really big Band-Aid. Because, yeah, they're going to support it today, but what's their policy going to be in a year from now? Are they just going to say, okay, well, we gave you a year, and now you need to do something about that. You need to upgrade. Well, at the end of the day, you're going to need to upgrade, harden, improve that old infrastructure anyway. So if the life of that is deemed to be on-prem and in a hybrid configuration forever, then I would probably say that the better project to spin up, instead of moving that potentially to the cloud and putting a Band-Aid on that, is maybe addressing the core problem and doing the upgrade on-prem. And if you just simply don't have the resources for that, and the Band-Aid is good enough, then you're good. You're good to go. So, all right, Scott. I think probably have time for. Do we have time for any more?
Yeah, probably one more. What do organizations do to provide a secure hybrid computing environment?
Great question. Great question. And this is one that, you should leave this particular summit asking everyone inside of your IT organizations, is that what do we do to provide a secure and reliable and safe computing environment? And so my number one piece of advice to organizations is, your systems are not going to harden themselves. You need a project for, server and infrastructure hardening, and that begins by doing an assessment. And so what are some of the easiest ways for your organization to do an assessment? Well, as a Microsoft guy, as a Microsoft MVP, I see a lot of customers using Defender Advanced Threat Protection. One of the things that Defender Advanced Threat Protection will give you is a complete and comprehensive vulnerability scan of your infrastructure. It'll tell you all of the applications and all of the CVE vulnerabilities that are targeting any of your core servers. If you have the ability with an E5 license, you may not even know this, you already own a Defender Advanced Threat Protection with your E5 license. Get that onto your desktops, and it'll do the same thing for you. It'll get your vulnerability scans going, and it'll show you the landscape that you have right now. And it's kind of cool because it'll actually scorecard you, and it'll show you how well your organization is doing. So from an executive leadership and kind of project management perspective, it'll show how you're improving things as you lock everything down. Now, you're not going to be able to get everything locked down overnight. It's a process, and it's a project to have to go through all of this. But doing nothing is not an option either, because that's the type of low-hanging fruit that the threat actors absolutely love. And a little thing that I'm saying inside of all of my sessions now is that if you RDP to anything inside of your infrastructure, you're going to MFA it, because RDPing without MFA is not a good idea. And so you should have plans in place to be locking down and securing that inside of your infrastructure. So if you RDP to it, MFA it, go multi-factor, make sure that you're locking down and securing it. All right, okay. Scott, any more, or are we done?
Nope, I think we're good. I think that's all that we've got time for here. So thanks again, Dave, and everybody stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, which is Hybrid Cloud 102, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Enterprise Configuration. Again, take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Nutanix, and we will be right back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sorry for that brief delay. And I'd like to say thank you for being here and staying on the line, and thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsor, Nutanix, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review. I'm here to moderate the second session of our Hybrid Cloud 101 Summit, titled Hybrid Cloud 102, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Enterprise Configuration. Our speaker for this section is Greg Schultz, founder and IT analyst at Server Storage IO. Greg has worked as the customer in various IT organizations in different roles, as well as a vendor, consulting analyst, and author of several books, including Software-Defined Data Infrastructure Essentials. Greg brings a diverse background with real-world perspective across applications, data infrastructures, hardware, software, and clouds. He's a Microsoft MVP, Cloud Data Center Management, and previous 10-time VMware vExpert. Greg, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Great, thanks, David. Hello and welcome, everybody, to today's discussion, Hybrid Cloud Configuration. I am Greg Schultz from Server Storage IO, and let's get started. And let's start our conversation regarding Hybrid Cloud 102, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Enterprise Configuration. All right, so here's just a real quickly what we're going to go through today. And this is that reminder also to submit questions. Let's get those worked into the queue as we get going, and we'll address some of them as we go, and we'll have time at the end to go through some. But hey, look, we've talked about the pros and cons of public, private, hybrid, and multi-cloud, as well as enterprise cloud migration best practices. So now, let's look at the best practices for the configuration of your hybrid cloud along with associated topics. We're going to take a look at from on-prem at the core to on-prem at the edge to the public cloud, spanning hybrid, multi-cloud, as well as multi-platform in different facets. We're also going to talk about do-it-yourself or DIY versus turnkey options and solutions, as well as architectural deployment considerations, software licensing, hybrid cloud cost topics, security and networking, along with initial and recurring management activity. And again, that plug, that reminder, along with your questions and what you want to talk about. All right, so with that, let's get started with from on-prem core to edge to the public cloud. And where and what is your hybrid cloud data infrastructure focus? In other words, is it holistic? Is it looking at everything? Or are you looking at things from a networking or from a storage or from a server or hypervisor or container or from an application or database? What's your focus area? And is it cloud? Is it legacy? There's all these different aspects. And what we're going to see as we have this discussion for the next 45 minutes to an hour, whatever our time slot works here for us, is a couple of recurring themes. You're going to see that graphic that's over on the right and across the lower right bottom, which is to indicate that this is really a multi-dimensional topic in that there is horizontally spanning different services, solutions, technologies, as well as locations. And then on that vertical scale there, over on the far right, that we're also looking at and discussing different layers, different focus, call them stacks, layers in the stacks, altitudes, different topic areas. And then if you notice up there on the top right over there where I said edge, well, there is what we'll call the core, the traditional data center, but also the cloud aspect to it. But edge, also known as the remote, the distributed, different facets, that's also something that's becoming more and more common and popular as part of a hybrid. And out at the edge, there can be a similar or the same infrastructure, software, hardware, technology, tools, practices, processes, that are either the same as what you have back at the core or very, very similar. And they can be do-it-yourself, DIY, they can be turnkey, they can come from different providers. So that's what we're going to see as we keep working our way through this material. But just a quick reminder is that data infrastructures include the compute storage, or the compute, the servers, the storage, the I/O networks, the hardware, the software, the resources, the management tools, best practices, policies, security, monitoring, configuration, along with the allocation, the provisioning, diagnostic, maintenance, all the things that craft and define the hardware, the software, all the different resources into a collective solution that supports the applications and transforms data into information. That's what the data infrastructure is. Data infrastructures exist inside physical data centers, whether they're your own, whether a remote branch or a remote location, equipment closet, equipment room. It could also be a turnkey and a rack, a cloud in a box, if you like. But that data infrastructure is what exists inside the facilities. All these things that come together, that get defined via management tools and other mechanisms. So what does your on-site, on-prem data infrastructure look like today? What is that target state? What is that outcome that you're looking to have it accomplish and do? How are you using cloud today as part of your data infrastructure? Are you all in? Have you gone just total all cloud? Or are you still some legacy or some mix of cloud and legacy, different aspects to it? What is it that you're currently doing? What do you have or plan for edge data infrastructures, for remote, for branch, for work group, for supporting remote operations, distributed sites? What are your objectives for enabling a hybrid cloud? Is it to reduce cost? Is it to adapt the technology to your environment, where your applications are, where your users are, for better availability, reliability? What is it that you're going to hybrid cloud for? Is it to avoid lock-in with a particular approach, a particular architecture, a particular location? And something that we'll also keep re-echoing and visiting as we work through on this journey is, what are your workloads and what are your resource needs? So with having that in mind, let's continue to build on this. So building this out a little bit, this is a little bit simplified, but again, that view of that data infrastructure, it's all the different things that are coming together. And what does this have to do with hybrid? Everything. Because keep in mind, what we talked about a couple moments ago is over there on the right. There are these various stacks, layers, focus areas, altitude, however you want to refer to them, that align with, from the networking, from the storage, from the compute, from the devices, the software that configures them, the software that enables them, the hypervisors, the containers, the orchestration, the management, all those different things that come together that support those, that are the bill of materials that support that service catalog that support your applications, whatever they may be. So it's all about that supporting that services. And keep in mind that while we're working in this hybrid cloud configuration for the enterprise, regardless of the size of your enterprise, that we've got those vertical layers, but also that we're spanning horizontally across different services, solutions, technologies, and locations. So your software-defined data infrastructure, your data infrastructure if you prefer, or hybrid cloud, will span multiple locations. Part of that processing, part of those resources could be on-prem. Some of them could be at one or more different cloud or co-location, different options there. So let's continue to build out on this. And as we continue our journey, there we go. As we continue our journey, we'll take a look at a little bit more detail. Now, we've added a lot more things into here, but as you see, we're building the story out. And as a part of this building out, we're seeing how that hybrid fits in. And now as we take a look at this, we see what we had before. Upper layer, the display, the access, whether it be via VDI or traditional desktop, smartphones, different devices, IoT devices up there across the top, different ways of consuming, different ways of accessing it. And this ties back to that hybrid in that your desktop services may in themselves be virtual. It might be a VDI. It might be a desktop as a service approach of how you're being able to use and access the underlying services that are part of that hybrid cloud. So as we look down into within that dotted area there, that is your data infrastructure, and that could be spanning. Part of it on that left could be in a legacy, physical, on-site, on-prem, on-premise, whatever your preference for referring to it is. And over there on the right, that could be in the public cloud. It could be in one or more public clouds, so multi-cloud. It could be in one or more different availability zones or data centers within a given region. So there's a lot of different options, a lot of different choices that come back to what is it that you need, what is it that you're trying to accomplish, are you optimizing for performance, for availability, for rapid resumption? You want to be able to recover fast, or more importantly, be able to just simply resume, to tolerate outages. It's not if the cloud will have an outage, it's when, just like any other technology. So the idea is to design and have your architecture, your configuration, to be resilient, to be tolerant of different things that can and will happen. Okay, so now let's go a little bit deeper, and again, we're going to keep referring to these different stacks and layers, and the reason for doing that is quite forward, quite simple, is that you might be familiar with what's involved for storage, or you might be familiar with compute, whether it's bare metal, legacy, whether it's virtual machines and hypervisors, serverless, containers, Docker, Kubernetes, whatever your focus might be. It might be from the networking. It might be from security. It could be from data protection, backup, archiving. It could be from a overall management or architecture. It might be from an operating system or a desktop perspective. It could be from the database, whether it be a SQL or a NoSQL type database or repository. But the idea there is that there's some layer of familiarity, and that maybe you've got that familiarity across up and down these different layers. Well, that becomes important in that as you start to do this configuration, as you start refining your architecture, if you don't have that already, or building that out, is keeping that in mind. Who are the different people, the different resources, the different teams that need to come together to put this all together? And where this becomes important as part of that hybrid configuration is to leverage the different skill sets of the teams, the different teams, but to create a virtual team, so to speak. You're creating that virtual environment, and that virtual environment is going to be hybrid, spanning sites, locations, different tools, different technologies. Hence, you also have to have the different skill sets, those different focus areas. So that's why we've got those different layers to put those in perspective, that whether it be from a management, a configuration, a remediation, a provisionment, that we've got that visibility, but also that communication and that orchestration flow up and down and across those different technologies. So the question that comes up is, all right, it's all straightforward. Does everything have to be from one particular provider? In other words, does it all have to be AWS, Amazon Web Services, or does it all have to be Microsoft, whether it be Microsoft Azure-based or Microsoft Windows Server-based, or does it also be VMware or OpenStack? Or and the answer is no. That's part of the idea around hybrid is, for lack of a better phrase, having it your way. Having that data infrastructure, having those resources, those components, having the hardware, the software adapt to your environment. How are you going to define it? How are you going to craft it to work for you? That could also be the different management pieces to it. So now, with that in mind, let's go and just address a couple things here real quick. All right. So we've talked in previous sessions about public, private, other, and hybrid. This is just a quick synopsis. The idea around hybrid is it's the best of both worlds, the best of being public, the best of being private, the best of having legacy, the best with new. and the best of being able to have it your way. Articulate, define, craft an architecture, craft that deployment to meet your needs versus having your environment adapt to whatever a particular technology, service, solution, or provider does. That's part of having that hybrid, that capability. So also, I could refer to hybrid as the IT home run. And again, quite simply, it's having it your way, having that environment adapt to you and your workload, your applications, your business, instead of the other way around. All right. So with that in mind, a little bit more on hybrid. Hybrid can be hybrid infrastructure, as you may already know. It's a mix of legacy, open systems, Windows, bare metal, virtual machines, containers. It can also get into the hybrid cloud, having part of your data infrastructure on-prem, part of it at a public cloud, maybe part of it in a colo. But also we have the multi-cloud, where we're not only spanning different regions, different data centers, different availability zones within a given cloud provider, also across cloud providers. So for example, you're spreading data, spreading apps, spreading things across, say, AWS, Google, Azure, among others. And why are you doing that? That gets back to that topic, that question we asked a little bit earlier on is, it could be for cost, it could be for availability, it could be just simply that you don't want all your applications, all your data in one basket of eggs, so to speak. But it also means that you could go hybrid even with just one provider. You could go hybrid with AWS. Granted, not until recently that they talk about AWS or hybrid with things like Outpost, but where the industry has moved, it's that hybrid environment, a mix of on-prem, public cloud, at the core, at the edge, with different technologies. And as a part of that, realizing there is also that multi-cloud, that multi-platform, where you might have VMware running on AWS or on Azure, that you might have Microsoft Windows technology running on AWS, Azure, with different apps across it, that you may have some SQL Server, some MySQL, Cassandra, Mongo, whatever repositories you want, that are running across the different clouds, but that you may also be using a cloud provider-specific database repository, as an example. So again, this comes back to where and what is your focus, what areas are you looking at, and why are you trying to do all of this? There's a lot of different technologies, tools that can be put together in different ways. That's part of that idea of hybrid. Have it your way. How do you want to craft it? So what are your different options? Are you going to go software only? Are you going to go appliance? Are you going to go turnkey? Are you going to do it yourself? And what is it that you're going to use? So we'll talk more about some of those options here in just a few moments. But also, what are your financial and recurring cost considerations? You know, over the past several years has been the mantra, go to the cloud to cut costs. Go to the cloud to save money. Go to the cloud to offload your management tasks, to offload your hardware spending. Yeah, you can accomplish that, but guess what? You may also see your cloud cost, your operating expense pertaining to cloud costs go up. You may find that there are different management considerations, and that you might just find that for some things there is that element of control, security, being able to have certain things under your direct control, regardless if the cloud can do it better or the same or whatever. But in some cases it's about that control. But we want to be upfront about talking about and be aware, go in eyes wide open as a part of this consideration, and using clouds in general, but also with the cost and the recurring costs of management, but also network access. Most of the cloud providers, they don't charge you for putting data in to their cloud. They'll charge you for storing the data, and they'll charge you for pulling the data out. So those are things that factor in to your consideration and into your architecture that we'll touch on here some of the different considerations. So how will you manage this? Are you going to have different tools? Are you going to have different stacks, different layers for managing the different pieces? Or are you going to have a hybrid management that allows you from some number of tools, maybe it's one, maybe it's multiples, but to have the ability to dig in and go up and down those vertical stacks, but also to go across horizontally across those different stacks as a part of managing, not only for insight, awareness, reporting, but for remediation, troubleshooting, diagnostic, provisioning, upgrades. A couple other things we have to keep in mind there as part of this configuration are, what are your staff considerations and training? Are they up to speed on these newer technologies? And if not, what do you need to have in place to support them? And what's your test environment going to look like, your development? All right? So, next up, let's look at real quickly DIY versus turnkey and packaging options. So here's a key thing to keep in mind. Hardware needs software. Software needs hardware. Hardware gets defined by software. Software needs to run on hardware. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, and I bring that up because there's this feeling, well, let's just go with software. We don't have to worry about anything. You still do. There are some different things to keep in mind. There are different software, appliances, and hardware options. You can go and get the software from different vendors, different providers, and put it on the hardware of your choice that is supported by those particular vendors. But there's also the turnkey. So one of the things that you'll hear about are converged infrastructure, hyper-converged infrastructures, clouds in a box, tin-wrapped software. Tin-wrapped software is nothing more than an appliance, hardware that has the software pre-configured, pre-installed. That's turnkey. So in other words, where the emphasis is on the software, that software still needs to have that hardware somewhere. So you're just keeping the emphasis on the software, but you're saying it's tin wrapped. It's got the hardware. It's got the metal wrapped around it. But you've got different options. And some of these are for smaller environments. Some are for medium. Some are for large. Some can scale up. Some can scale out with clustering for high availability or for growth. Some can scale down. There are also different resource and management tools that are out there. We should also mention about open source. So here's the thing about open source, is open source might be free. However, running it, the required hardware and management is not free. There is a cost to it. And are you in the business of supporting and being an integrator or of doing some other business function? So those are things to keep in mind, is balancing the cost and the time savings of turnkey versus DIY versus some combination. Again, our theme is hybrid, so you can actually have that hybrid option where you're using some turnkey, but you're also doing some DIY as a part of adapting it to your particular environment. But keep in mind, anything that you do DIY, anything that you use where you're crafting it and putting it together, who's going to support it? How's it going to be supported on a go-forward basis along with those associated costs? So will you be deploying these resources on-site, on-prem, at the edge, in a colo or elsewhere? And how are you going to manage and maintain the solution along with additional integrations over time? And how will that solution scale without increasing complexity? Complexity adds cost. So what are some different examples of packaging options? In other words, some of these are rack-based, some of these are small, some of them scale up very, very large. Pretty much the standard is that the software is independent of the hardware. That's something to keep in mind. However, how the vendors choose to deliver that, the hardware might be tied to the software, i.e. it's tin wrapped. The software could be picked up and moved elsewhere in most cases, but in some scenarios, the vendors are also adding value add. They're adding offload engines to accelerate graphics like GPU cards or network I/O, TCP toes or offload engines to help accelerate the performance, to help offload the main service so that those are able to do more work. But there's examples of some different software. You got your containers and Docker and Kubernetes and all the different variations and tools that go along with that. From a public cloud perspective, AWS has something called Outposts, which basically takes a subset of what you'd find in the core AWS offerings for compute, storage, and pushes those out into a turnkey solution that gets deployed out at the edge. Now, being out with AWS and the Outpost, it is a bundled solution. There's not much DIY. The appliance shows up, it goes into wherever you're going to deploy it to. There's some management set up, but it's also managed via your main AWS management tool set. Microsoft. So in the case of Microsoft, there's several different pieces here. There is leveraging Microsoft Azure with Azure Stack, leveraging Microsoft Azure with Windows, whether it be integrating via Azure Active Directory or leveraging something called Azure Arc Management or the Azure IoT platform, or even Windows Admin Center, where you're able to set up that hybrid, whether it be from a management or from a connectivity, or even moving workloads around. You've got solutions like Nutanix, basically giving you a cloud in a box, OpenStack, OpenShift, VMware, among many others that can be put together, but also layered at different points, including on top of each other as part of a solution. Why would you pick one or the other? What are your needs? What are your requirements? But also, what are your preferences? What do you currently have? So as a part of that deployment considerations, how will the technology adapt to your data infrastructure needs? I always like to say is, how will the technology work for you instead of you working for the technology? Well, let's keep that in mind. That recurring theme, it's important to keep the different layers in perspective. You know, those higher up from the desktop to the applications. Maybe you're using software as a service. So instead of having an Office set of tools, you're using something like an O365. Maybe you're using something like a Salesforce. That's okay. Well, all those fit into it. And how is your hybrid environment going to support those, and how will they work with your hybrid environment? How will you do management? So there's also some things coming into play here with networking, whether it's distance, whether it's bandwidth, whether it's latency, but there's also the security aspects. If you're going to have that hybrid environment and you're going to have your data in that cloud, how are you handling your endpoints? Are you just using the low to no cost public IPs, the general public endpoints, or are you using the private endpoints that have a recurring cost per hour, per day, per month that can add up? What is it that? How are you presenting that? How are you leveraging your firewalls? How are you leveraging your IP blocking and your authentication as a part of securing that environment, but yet maintaining that connectivity? So the other thing about networking to keep in mind is, as I mentioned before, you don't get charged for sending your data in. It's when your data comes back out, that egress. So something to be aware of is, how can you architect, how can you design and configure to minimize how much data is being pulled out? So for example, if you've got an application that you're constantly pulling data out of the cloud for whatever purpose, maybe there should be a copy of that local. And that, again, that comes back to this hybrid is, if all of your users or if all your apps are local but the data is in the cloud, you might be getting beat up by those recurring network egress charges. Well, maybe that means having a copy of the data on site, or at least having a mechanism where you can do that in mind. And that could be for a database. It could also be for file systems, for file caching, where you have that idea that everybody that's authorized, authenticated to work on that file system can work on it, but that you've got local caching for reads and writes, where the data does go back to the cloud, say for an authoritative copy, but that you can minimize the amount of data that gets pulled out because it's compressed, it's dedo. There's not as much of it that has to move in each direction all the time. So those are some different things to keep in mind as a part of that configuration. I mentioned rights and roles, and whether you're having like an Active Directory, whether you're having a unified Active Directory that's tied in with the cloud for authentication, for admin rights, for granting of rights and privileges and roles, but also for the revocation, so that you can revoke access, you can revoke things when and where needed. Part of that architecture deployment consideration is where is the workload, where are the users going to be, but also how will maintenance and updates and remediation be done? Where are they going to be done? How are they going to be done? Even on the cloud, they still need to be done. What will the cloud provider do for you? What do you need to do? How do you coordinate that you're on common updates across the board? And how will you manage bursting? The surge for people coming in the morning, say on a Monday, and then thing tapers off, and then be able to have the right amount of resources when needed, but be able to throttle those down when they're not needed, but then have them back up just in time. So in other words, maximizing your cost. It's not just about cutting costs. It's not just about driving up utilization. It's also about driving up productivity, driving up the effectiveness of how you're using those different resources. So it's having that look at not just utilization efficiency, but also effectiveness, that productivity, that service level, getting more work done with what you have available, but having that visibility, that insight, that situation awareness up and down the different layers, but also horizontally across, while you're maintaining that integration with the different platforms and the clouds, and also having that security and data protection. Now, software licensing. So you go to the cloud. Well, doesn't the cloud, what about your software licensing? Well, that's why we're bringing this up. Are you able to use your existing software licenses when you set a hybrid environment? Or will a cloud provider require you to use their licenses? That's something that we need to keep in mind, that we need to keep in perspective here. So with that in mind, do you need to have new software licenses? Are there any trade-in incentives? And what are your cloud costs accordingly? And part of that cloud cost is understanding what type of an instance, for example, what type of a virtual machine do you need to have to run a particular application from a different vendor. Having the right amount. It's not always having the lowest or the lowest performing. Sometimes you may need to pay a little bit more for a more robust instance that's got more memory, that's got more cores, so that you can get more work done, but also support more users. And the net result is a better productivity, a better total cost of ownership. So a couple things to look at here is you can cut costs and cause potential service impacts, or you can right size, you can reduce management costs, you can leverage cloud platform discounts, you can pre-buy. If you're buying ad hoc as you walk up, you're not getting the best value. If you know you're going to be on a platform for a year, 2 years, 3 years, why not prepay if there's a good discount, a good incentive for doing that? All right. So it looks like we got a couple of questions. Let's walk through a couple of these real quickly. We've got a question here. Which Microsoft Azure instance is used by Snowflake? Good question. Off the top of my head, I don't know. And if you're not familiar with Snowflake, Snowflake is a data repository. So you might be able to do something like Google Snowflake Microsoft Azure instance and see what it tells you, or go to the Snowflake website where they've got configuration that'll tell you what would be a good instance. And what I like about that question is, it ties back, it's not unique to Snowflake, is that if you're going to bring some software, if you're going to deploy that software, whether it be Azure, whether it be AWS, Google, IBM, whatever it happens to be, understand what are the underlying resources needed for that. How much CPU do you need? How many cores? What speed of cores? How much memory? Do you need GPUs for graphics offload? Do you need network offload or accelerators? So keep all that in perspective regardless of what that application is. All right, let's keep moving along here. And with that in mind, as mentioned before, there's some networking and security things to consider here. We're not going to go line by line on these. You've got access to these via the handouts, via the recording. But just keep in mind that multi-site, those locations, that there are the different networking considerations. There are the security. How are you going to protect those endpoints? How are you going to protect the IPs? How are you going to perform data protection, backups, archiving, and configurations from a granular standpoint, as well as have air gaps to protect against ransomware? And there's also the old school, evolving from the old school 321 to the new school 4321, which I'll touch on here in the next slide. Speaking of air gaps, there are different gaps for data protection. The good gaps are air gaps, time gaps, intervals. The bad gaps are missed recovery points, missed protection, not having the right granularity of what you're protecting, when, where, and why. And the ugly, what you thought was recoverable, what you thought was protected, isn't there. So real quickly, what's the 321 versus 4321? Well, the old 321 was just having multiple copies, multiple locations, one of those offline. 4321 just extends that, having multiple copies of different time intervals and versions with at least 2 or more on different systems, devices, of which one of them has an air gap and is off-site, offline. And you can learn more about that in some of the material that we've got mentioned here in the wrap-up. Data protection is evolving. That might be part of why you're doing hybrid cloud. That might be why you're taking a look at this environment. But just keep, when you do your hybrid, keep data protection in mind. Keep those layers. How are you going to protect at different layers, at different altitudes, at different focus points? Leverage data footprint reduction, archiving, compression, deduplication, reducing bandwidth optimization. Okay, now I touched on the initial and recurring management activity. So how are you going to do this? Well, again, it's looking up and down that stack, but also that horizontally, and designing management and maintenance into the architecture, being aware of the initial and recurring tasks and what can be automated. How are you going to handle the remediation, the updates? Is everything up to date? Where are your gaps in coverage? But also looking at the performance and the security and the networking. Are you aware of your management costs? You know how much you're paying, what are you being in, what are the different charges, as well as what are the different options out there for managing, the different tools that can manage across different locations, across different vendors, tools, and technologies, but also up and down those different layers, those different parts of the stack. Okay, so we've got everything configured. We've got it architected. How are you going to get your data there? What's your migration? And we talked about this on a previous webinar, previous session, but are you going to move? Are you going to convert? Are you going to rebuild? These are all parts of that consideration of the journey to the hybrid cloud for your environment. All right, so let's wrap up so we can get into a few more Q&A topics here. And wrapping up for now, not everything is the same, so why treat it the same? That's the idea of having hybrid. Have hybrid data protection, that hybrid management, the hybrid teams, the hybrid cloud. Gain and maintain that situational awareness up and down the stack across the different locations, services, and tools. Know your biz and app requirements. What are your workloads? That ties back to the question about what would a Snowflake need for a particular instance type? Well, what would your database need for a particular application requirement? What kind of activity is it doing? Design, maintenance, and management into the solution that we talked about, but keep those different stack and layers in perspective. A couple other pieces there where to learn more. My site, storageio.com, my blog, StorageIO blog, but also my books. A lot of what we've covered here today comes right out of software-defined data infrastructure essentials, also data infrastructure management insights and strategies. So anyway, those are where you can learn more about what we've just talked about on this quick journey and from the other sessions that are taking place. All right, so with that, we made up a little bit of time there. Sorry again for that little delay in getting started. But David, I think we've got time for some questions, and a reminder to our audience is bring in those questions.
Sure. We do have time for a few questions, so let's just get right to them. You know, security is always a important topic in these discussions. And the question is, why worry about cloud data protections as cloud platforms handle that for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that comes up quite a bit, candidly, is that, yes, the cloud providers do have data protection. They do have a couple pieces to it, which is maintaining durability. Is the data intact with multiple copies? But also, is it available and accessible, i.e. spreading the data around so that it can be available? However, you have to look at is what's the granularity? What's that focus? Is it at a system level? Is it at a virtual machine level? Is it at a volume or a file system level? Is it at an entire database level? And at what consistency point? Is it based on when the last snapshot was done? What's that consistency point? What's that time interval? And then how does that line up with what granularity you need from a business operational, or even from a transactional perspective? So you may have that underlying capability similar to what you have with regular storage, with snapshots, or having that a virtual machine snapshot. That's that level of granularity. What level of granularity of fidelity do you need? Do you need to bring back an individual table versus an entire database?
Okay, great. Here's a question asking about the difference between multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. Question reads, is multi-cloud a different way of saying hybrid cloud and vice versa?
I'm not going to get upset if you call having part of your data on-prem and part of it at Azure and part of it at AWS. If you want to call that hybrid cloud, that's fine with me. I'm not going to sit there and parse out what's right or proper. Go for it. Likewise, if you're just running between AWS and Azure, or Azure and Google, or AWS and IBM, if you want to call it multi-cloud, go for it. If you want to call it hybrid cloud, I'm fine with it. It's like you want to call it on-site, on-prem, on-premise, on-premises. You're too focused on that. You're missing out on more important topics.
Okay. Let's move right along here. Are cloud gateways needed for accessing cloud storage?
Yeah, it depends. If you had this question a few years back, it was probably a very strong probability the answer would have been yes. Today, it's a maybe. It's a maybe because more and more of certain type of cloud storage access is built into what you're running on-site, on-prem, whether it be the hypervisors, the operating system, the applications, the storage systems, eliminating that need for a gateway. On the other hand to it, there are now tools that can be running on-prem, for example, that not only have that gateway functionality, but also add value like automatic tiering, moving the data around, doing the caching, doing the bandwidth optimization, handling some of that functionality to abstract and abstract the complexities of the cloud behind it.
Okay. Next question. Does hybrid cloud have to be an all or nothing thing, or can it be used just for certain things like development?
It's a have it your way. Have it your way. You want hybrid cloud for development? Go for it. You want to supersize the hybrid cloud for production? That sounds fantastic. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. That's, again, that real capability is have it your way. How do you need to use it? How is it going to adapt to your environment? So you could be doing, some would say, well, do all your development in the cloud, and if you can't deploy in the cloud, well, then run it on-prem, or vice versa. It's giving you that capability of what you want to do, how you want to use it, that makes sense for what you're going.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Greg, for your informative presentation and answering those questions.
No worries, David. My pleasure.